Hi everyone. This episode of Terrifying Trios is concerned with horrifying harlequins and jeering jesters. This time, we're talking about clowns. Content warning. The following movies and book contain graphic scenes of violence, including murder, pet death, stabbings, axe murder, body horror, hangings, bugs, immolation, death by blood draining, shootings, falling, conversations and images related to suicide, and more. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. And perhaps this goes without saying, but if you have a phobia of clowns, perhaps skip this episode. Our first film this month is the 1987 B-movie Ghost House. The film begins in 1967, after a girl named Henrietta Baker is given a large clown doll for her birthday. The audience first meets her father, when he goes looking for Henrietta in the basement and discovers that she's killed the family's cat with a pair of scissors. Thankfully, the cat in question is very fake. Henrietta's father leaves her in the basement to think about what she's done. She sits down with her clown doll, and back upstairs her parents discuss the change in their daughter just before being killed by a mostly unseen attacker. All we see is a rotting human hand wielding first an axe and then a knife. Henrietta sheds a single tear. She clearly knows what's happened, and after the camera focuses on Henrietta hugging her clown doll for a moment, we jump forward in time. 20 years later, in 1987, we find ourselves in Boston. A ham radio operator / data processing guy named Paul gets a call from his girlfriend, Martha, who is ambiguously European. If I seem flip at times while describing the truly bonkers plot here, it bears noting that I've seen this film many times, always with commentary by the Riff Tracks crew. Later, Paul and Martha talk about a strange thing Paul overheard on his radio the night before. It sounded as though someone were screaming for help. At this point, Martha announces that she's going to get some of the chili that Paul prepared earlier. Remember, if you're not sure how to move a story along, a non sequitur can get you to the next scene in your low-budget horror movie. Paul realizes that he has forgotten to call a ham radio friend, so he goes to the living room and turns on his radio. After Paul turns the dial, a strange sound emanates from the machine, almost like low, heavy breathing. He quickly asks Martha to bring him a nearby tape recorder, and they record the following. A man on the radio says, "What do you want? For God's sakes, somebody help me! Help! Help!" Then the man is heard screaming, and soon after this sound cuts off, a second person screams. These sounds end, and creepy organ music plays for a few seconds before the signal cuts out, and Paul's ham radio friend comes on to say he's been trying to reach him. That conversation is immediately forgotten, and Paul and Martha discuss what they captured on the tape recorder. Paul insists that it sounds real, because to fake such a thing would be unethical in the world of ham radio. No, really, this is what he says. And Martha asks if he can trace the source of the sound. The next day, armed with what Paul has learned from analyzing the radio signal on his computer, the couple leaves Boston. First, they pick up a hitchhiker named Pepe near the coast, and then they meet a strange, gruff man with a limp outside the house that the radio signal leads them to. Inside, the house is deserted and described by our protagonists as abandoned, though, like many horror movie houses, it's strangely well lit. Martha is uncomfortable, but Paul insists that they press on, and in the attic they find a ham radio. This is the only ham radio-based horror movie that I know of, but you know what? It's a nice pre-cell phone twist on remote communication and creepy messages that also act as harbingers of doom. It turns out that the radio is owned by a young man, roughly Paul and Martha's age. Early 20s, I'm thinking. Paul seems to have a job, and Martha is in America on a scholarship. This man is named Jim Dalen, and he has a camper parked out in the yard. He's traveling with his brother, Mark, Mark's girlfriend, Susan, and the youngest of the bunch, Jim and Mark's teenage sister, Tina. Jim kindly tells us all this while also pointing some kind of skewer at Paul and Martha, thinking they've perhaps come to steal his radio. Though it was clearly Jim's voice on the radio the night before, and Jim is disturbed by his recorded distress, he insists that it's impossible because he didn't plug in the radio the night before. While Paul and Jim go up on the roof to verify this claim, Martha hears strange organ music coming from downstairs. In the basement, Martha encounters Henrietta and her creepy clown doll. Martha then spots a severed head spinning around in the dryer, and canned goods begin to explode around her before the basement's only light bulb also explodes. Martha's screams bring Paul and Jim down to the basement. They get her outside, and everyone gathers around Jim's camper, where we meet Mark, Susan, and Tina. Why are they vacationing at an abandoned house? It's never explained. Susan thinks that the whole story about the creepy radio recording sounds made up, but the group agrees that they want to see if Jim's voice will come on the radio again that night. To test this, Paul and Martha drive a couple of miles away with Susan. There's a ham radio set up in the back of Paul's truck. Jim and Mark stay in the house with their ham radio, and Tina stays inside the camper for reasons that are never explained. But, since this is a horror movie, the audience understands that all this splitting up is how you start paring down the cast. No one's been murdered yet, but it's finally almost time. From the attic, Jim and Mark hear what sounds like maniacal laughter coming from the basement. Jim leaves his brother with the radio, apparently bent on fulfilling his own tragic destiny. He goes downstairs to check out the sound, and in the basement, upon seeing Henrietta and her clown doll, he says the exact words he heard himself say on the recording. Then Jim is killed when the blade of an unplugged metal fan flies off and slices his throat. Now we know that his scream was cut off by his death. Meanwhile, Tina is outside in the camper where she has the TV on. Suddenly, Henrietta and her clown doll appear on the screen. Their creepy theme music starts to play, and Tina is frozen in terror after trying and failing to get the TV to turn off. Also, Henrietta is crying tears of blood for reasons that are never made clear. I guess because she's seen so much death. The TV abruptly turns itself off, and the camper begins to shake violently. Tina flees and goes inside the house, looking for her older brothers. She finds Jim's body and screams. Hers is the second scream from the original recording, and the group miles away hears the same sounds as the night before over the ham radio, even though the radio belonging to the Dalens was in the attic at the time of Jim's death, not the basement. This is further proof that the ghost house is super haunted, though this is the one and only time that it predicts or literally broadcasts someone's death via radio. While the group in the truck races back to the house, the surviving Dalens are confronted by the strange man that Paul and Martha saw earlier that day. When morning comes, the police arrive, and an officer explains that the strange man, who ran away after stabbing Mark in the arm, is the house's caretaker, and now naturally the prime suspect in Jim's murder, though those present at the time know that this doesn't make sense. Paul and Martha say their goodbyes to Mark, Tina, and Susan, and return home to try and analyze the mysterious sounds they recorded. Soon Paul discovers that the weird music he recorded following Jim's death is actually a distortion of the word burial, repeated over and over. Meanwhile, the police discuss Jim's murder, secure in the knowledge that the young people in the camper will soon leave the house, where they were parked illegally, but the police didn't force them to move. Yes, soon they'll be moving on. Unless, of course, they run into car trouble, which, naturally, they do. By this time, our heroes have heard the story of Henrietta's family from the police officer who arrived at the scene after Jim's death. All of the family died in 1967, but unlike her parents, who were brutally murdered, Henrietta's body was totally free of signs of violence, and her cause of death was a mystery. Paul decides to talk to Henrietta's father, Sam's former business partner, who runs a funeral home. Martha, by this time, is back with Paul after a brief argument, but she's scared by the whole situation and understandably irate that Paul is continuing to investigate all this weirdness. Paul learns from the funeral home director that Sam had a bad habit. He used to take things from the dead before they were buried, including the clown doll he gave to his daughter on her final birthday. Meanwhile, back at the ghost house, Mark has left his sister and girlfriend and taken Susan's motorcycle into town to get the part he needs to fix the camper. Tina meets Pepe, who is then killed off-screen inside the house. Then she sneaks out of the camper to look for him. Tina sees Henrietta and her clown for a second time, right before she is cut in half by an improbably sharp and extant ceiling guillotine. In what is truly a spectacle of questionable editing, Mark returns to the house at night, just in time to receive a call from Martha on the radio. Martha is calling from the local cemetery during daytime. She is then chased by the caretaker into Henrietta's extremely spacious tomb. Meanwhile, back at the house, Susan has tried to take a shower. For some reason, this house has power and running water, but instead blood comes out of the faucet. She then sees Tina's ghost and tries to apologize for not believing her about the house, but Tina's specter changes into the clown doll before disappearing. Susan soon encounters Pepe's corpse and finds that all the doors leading out of the house are locked. Then, at night, Mark comes inside looking for Susan, and when he sees Henrietta, he's sent crashing down into the basement, where he falls into a vat of some white liquid that seems to burn and disfigure him. After he manages to struggle up the stairs, Susan stabs him, thinking she's defending herself against another ghoul, only to realize after the fact that she stabbed her boyfriend. Back at the cemetery, in daytime, Paul searches for Martha after speaking to the cemetery groundskeeper, who also knows the story of Henrietta. Paul discovers the body of the house's caretaker hanging from a tree. Whether this is a suicide or the house somehow killing the man from a distance now that he has outlived his usefulness is never explained. Inside Henrietta's crypt, which again is quite large, Martha sees a very well-lit specter of death. We, the audience, don't see this until it appears before Susan back in the ghost house. It turns out to be a skull-faced robe figure holding a knife. Literally death minus the scythe. And it also just happens to be dripping with real live maggots. Also, it's nighttime again because of perhaps ghost powers. Again, this may just be a bad continuity issue. Back at the cemetery, still in daytime, Paul hears Susan scream for help over the radio. He decides that the only sensible thing to do here is to open up Henrietta's coffin, douse her and the clown doll in gasoline, and then set them on fire. This saves Susan from being stabbed by death, and she leaves the house on her motorcycle. Also, it's now daytime again at the ghost house, but very little time seems to have passed. Martha, in the truck, is confident that she'll feel better soon. We next see Martha back in Boston. She appears cheerful, as though she has recovered from her literal brush with death, until she sees the clown doll in the window display of a toy store. It looks exactly like Henrietta's clown doll, and it's smiling in a neutral sort of way, until Paul calls to Martha from across the street. Martha looks back at the doll and sees that its face has changed, as it has several times throughout this film. Its brows are lowered, and it's smiling with sharp teeth. Paul crosses the street to meet Martha, only to be hit and killed by a bus. Martha screams, and the movie ends. This film isn't good, but it has some unique ideas that figure into later, more successful horror films, namely in the role that technology can play in predicting or somehow causing supernatural death. It's full of cheap effects, bad choices, worse continuity, and of course, an evil clown doll with an unclear vendetta. Would it have never murdered anyone if it had just been buried with its original owner? Susan and Martha survived the film due to a combination of good luck and vague rules. Because again, trying to destroy the clown doll clearly doesn't work, or Paul wouldn't have died. But why did all the Dalens die? I don't know or especially care, but I've enjoyed this film for many years, so I rate it 3 maggots out of 5. Our next movie is the cult classic Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The theme song for this movie, which is mostly a repetition of the title, is delightfully campy and gives viewers a good sense of what's to come. A young couple, Mike, whose last name is Tobacco, and Debbie, Stone, a less weird surname, are parked at Lover's Lane with friends, thankfully in other cars, when they see a bright object fall from the sky, just outside their small town. A local farmer named Gene Green also sees this object, and believing it to be a comet, he sets off with his dog to find the point of impact. Fun fact, the actor who played Green was Royal Dano, who also lent his voice to Disney's Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. In the woods, Mr. Green finds what looks to be a circus tent. In reality, it's an alien spaceship full of clowns, with a K, creatures that just happen to look like monstrous clowns. Green is captured by the clowns, and when Mike and Debbie arrive to investigate the object they saw, they find that the tent-shaped ship contains a strange labyrinth of weird interior spaces, including a large room where Green is encased in a kind of cotton candy cocoon. But this can't be ripped away or removed because Green has also become sealed in a kind of gelatinous goo. When the pair of humans are discovered by the aliens, they quickly flee the clowns, who have such items at their disposal as a balloon dog that's alive and a weapon that shoots popcorn. While this all seems more whimsical than scary in writing, the practical effects in this film, namely the clown costumes, are just fantastic. They're wonderfully detailed and sinister looking. And while they can seem a bit awkward at times, they're not the fastest movie monsters ever. Like a ravening horde of zombies, these creatures really seem to hunger for the humans they're hunting. Mike and Debbie manage to escape the clowns and head to the police station, where they explain what they've seen to a skeptical Dave Hansen, who also just happens to be Debbie's ex, and Curtis Mooney, who you may remember as the Dean from Animal House. Mooney is in great form here. He seems to loathe rambunctious teens with a fiery passion, which makes him the perfect straight man and eventual victim of the killer clowns. Mike and Dave make sure that Debbie gets home safe. These three are presented almost as a throuple, which is a delightfully progressive subversion of the usually dull love triangle for a film that was released in 1988. Then, the two head out to where the ship is, or was, because now there's just a crater where the alien ship was before. Dave is still skeptical, obviously, of Mike's story, but the presence of the large crater convinces him that there's definitely something weird going on. Next, the two men head to Lover's Lane. The cars of those who were parked with Debbie and Mike are now empty. Only a sticky substance, the same one that cocooned Jean Green, is left behind. Meanwhile, clowns have begun shooting townsfolk with ray guns that trap them in the cotton candy like cocoons. They also do tricks to entice crowds to gather, and then kill spectators, presumably for sustenance and or sport. A child in a restaurant is almost tempted outside by a clown, and though some children, even today, really do like clowns, the idea that any kid would be amused and not terrified by this particular alien harlequin is a bit of a stretch. I guess that's why the attempted child ensnarement fails. Still trying to figure out what's really going on, Mike and Dave witness clowns performing a shadow puppet show for a group of hapless spectators. But then the humans watching the show are shrunk, bagged up, and carried off by the clowns. Back at the police station, Curtis Mooney is confronted by a clown. Naturally, he thinks the whole thing is a prank and is delighted by the prospect of arresting a teenage ne'er-do-well. When Dave next sees Curtis, he has been killed by said clown, his corpse turned into a crude ventriloquist dummy. When Dave shoots the clown in the nose, it explodes, so at least now our heroes know that their foes can be killed. While Dave is busy at the station, Mike finds his friends, the Terenzi brothers, who own an ice cream truck. They drive around town and try to warn people about the clowns via the truck's loudspeaker. Oh, and remember the popcorn from earlier? It's not actually a weapon. The popcorn these aliens have brought with them to Earth are actually a larval form of the clowns, which is not great for Debbie. Unbeknownst to our heroine, some popcorn stuck to her clothing earlier that evening. It gradually changes and grows, and eventually Debbie is horrified to discover a juvenile clown in her home. 5 grown clowns appear then and imprison Debbie inside a huge balloon. Dave, Mike, and the Terenzis see this happen, and they soon learn that the clowns have moved their ship to a more amenable environment, the local amusement park. At this point, you may be wondering, does this movie contain a scene in a creepy funhouse? And indeed, it does. Inside the funhouse, and later, the alien ship, the Terenzi brothers get lost while Mike and Dave search for Debbie. They manage to free her from the balloon prison, but only after they learn the horrifying truth of this wacky alien invasion. Once cocooned and trapped in gelatin, people become a food source for the clowns, who drink human blood. Soon, Dave, Debbie, and Mike have fled right into a series of traps, which ends in the trio surrounded by clowns. Fortunately, by this time, the Terenzis have found each other, and they use the loudspeaker on their ice cream truck to distract the hungry horde. This works briefly, but then the alien clowns reveal their ultimate weapon, a gigantic puppet called Jojo Clownzilla, which smashes the Terenzis' truck. Most of Act 3 of any horror movie involves fleeing from danger, and this movie is no different, as the trio of Dave, Debbie, and Mike are able to evade the clowns' traps and nearly reach the exit, but not quite. Dave manages to create a distraction long enough for Debbie and Mike to escape the clowns, and though it appears in the end that Dave and the Terenzis all died, the twist here is that they were able to escape in the wrecked truck before the clown's ship takes off. Yes, the truck was smashed, but the freezer remains intact, even when the truck falls out of the spaceship, thus saving the trio sheltering inside. The movie ends with the 5 survivors of this very strange night looking up at the sky. only to be hit in the face with falling pies as the clown ship blasts back into space. Killer Clowns from Outer Space is considered a cult classic for a number of reasons. Namely, it delivers on what it promises, and the effects, created and/or supervised by the Chiodo brothers, are well done and visually dynamic. Obviously, the clown masks are the stars here, but the giant clown puppet, played by Charles Chiodo, and the miniature set for the climactic battle is also a wonderfully fun and creepy creation. If you're looking for something that's garish, unsettling, and entertaining in equal measure, check out this movie. I rate it 4 clowns out of 5. Our book this month is Clown in a Cornfield, a young adult novel which, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, does exactly what it promises. Quinn is in high school, and she and her father, Glenn, have just moved to the small town of Kettle Springs. Glenn is a doctor, and he accepted the job as the town's sole physician, hoping for a fresh start. Quinn's hoping for the same. Ever since her mother died, she and her father have both been grieving, struggling with the fact that they couldn't help her more in her struggle with addiction. In Kettle Springs, Quinn soon finds that relationships between local teens and adults are extremely strained. After the death of his younger sister, local rich kid and popular content creator Cole Hill has been struggling with guilt over the accident that killed her, to the point that, in the past year, he burned down part of the Bay Pen corn syrup factory, which is closed and which his father owns. Quinn can see the factory from her bedroom window, and she can also see a huge painting of Frendo the Clown, the company and town's mascot. At school, after being kicked out of class by the angry history teacher, Quinn wasn't really doing anything, but one small nervous laugh was all it took to draw the man's ire. She meets Cole, Janet, Ronnie, and her boyfriend, Matt. Quinn is surprised to be accepted by the group. She played volleyball at her old school, but she wasn't at the top of the social hierarchy by any means. However, it's clear from the group's tales of their boring small town, and their love of making YouTube videos, that Quinn, being new, is an interesting novelty. Quinn is invited to Founders Day by her new friends, in spite of the fact that their history teacher, in kicking them out of class the day before, also barred them from the celebration. To blend in, the group wears cheap Frendo masks, except for Matt, who's dressed up in a full-body Frendo suit. Quinn is bemused by all the clown imagery, but what starts as a prank, her new friends set off some fireworks, ends in a very visible fender bender during the Founders Day parade. No one is hurt, but it's clear that many adults in town have had enough of flippant teens who are just biding their time until they can go to college and leave Kettle Springs forever. That night, Quinn goes to Janet's party with her new group of friends. It's in a barn in the middle of a cornfield. Quinn, being close with her dad, tells him about these events, and Glenn, relieved that his daughter is making some friends, happily gives her permission to go and have fun. Quinn isn't sure that hanging out in a barn with drunken strangers is fun exactly. She's never lived in such a rural area. And even though Cole seems to like her, and her new neighbor seems cool, if a bit distant, Quinn is still adjusting to her new surroundings. Still, she dances and has fun at the party, and finds that she's starting to feel okay about living in Kettle Springs for the rest of her high school career. Then the clowns attack. People dressed as Frendo the Clown emerge from the cornfield and begin killing teens. They wield various weapons, and while some fight back, others flee, or are killed trying to protect others. The rest of the novel concerns Quinn and other teens just trying to survive the night. It turns out that a group of adults in town have decided that the only way to save Kettle Springs is to create a huge tragedy. The plan is to kill a bunch of young people, and then frame Cole Hill, troubled teen, for the killing spree. The rationale here is that there will be an outpouring of grief and sympathy for the people of Kettle Springs, like there often is after a mass tragedy, and the aid money that will come in will help the town to rebuild. What makes matters, if possible even worse, is that Cole's father is in on the whole plan. With his wife and daughter gone, he's more than happy to sacrifice his son if it means shoring up his shrinking fortune. Obviously, this plan is great fodder for a horror story, but I agree if you think that it has some logistical problems. The group of clowns have Cole's father to supply them with weapons and equipment, and Quinn's father is kidnapped by the clowns to provide medical care to those who are injured trying to kill teens. These are significant strategic advantages. However, it's hard to imagine any group of people who are okay with dressing up as clowns and murdering kids having what it takes to keep a secret, at least not for long. But maybe the idea is that Cole's father planned to kill the clowns himself. After a night of horror like the one the group planned, what's a few more bodies? Of course, Quinn is our main character here, and serial killers almost never plan on victims that fight back, adapt quickly, and don't just meekly accept their fate. By the end of the night, most of the clowns have been killed or injured by Quinn and her friends as they try to defend themselves with power tools, guns, and really anything they can get their hands on. If Mr. Hill planned to murder his co-conspirators at the end of the night of clown-related bloodshed, maybe his plan could have worked. Yes, there would be a lot of conflicting forensic evidence, but in the wake of a mass tragedy, it's possible that irregularities would be missed. The stories of the surviving adults accepted in the absence of any teenage survivors. Instead, though, Quinn and some of her new friends survive, and Mr. Hill flees the country. I'm not going to tell you who all lives, though I will say that the author has stated that in the sequel, not every survivor of Book 1 gets lucky twice. This fast-paced young adult novel is great for fans of horror, and there's a third book coming soon, so check it out. Finally, if you're in the mood for history, visit JSTOR.org and learn about Grimaldi, who, in 1801, became in essence the first modern clown. His conspicuous makeup and clothes, acrobatic feats, and popular pantomime act made him a star in the early 19th century. But by the end of his life, and with the publication of a memoir written by Charles Dickens the year after his death, Grimaldi had become the sad clown archetype. On stage, he was a delight who made generations laugh. But in his personal life, he struggled with substance abuse and depression. Here's a quote from writer Ed Simon about this famous clown. In his own 1887 memoir, theater critic Thomas Goodwin recounted how Grimaldi visited a famed surgeon to find a cure for his melancholy. The doctor suggested he pursue relaxation and amusement, perhaps sometimes at the theater. Go and see Grimaldi. Alas, replied the patient, that is of no avail to me. I am Grimaldi. Again, to quote Simon, Grimaldi used his depression to artistic effect, as he also did with the uncanniness of his appearance. Creepiness wasn't inadvertent in Grimaldi's creation. The combined themes of division, concealment, and deterioration clearly provide the basic components for the sinister clowns that stalk us in the present day. While Gordon credits Dickens with crafting the creepy clown archetype. More than that, Dickens identified and communicated something sinister that had already been conceived by Grimaldi. Why do clowns scare people? The simple answer is that, like dolls and mannequins, clowns can easily fall into the uncanny valley, where something that looks mostly human, but not quite, becomes frightening. As a species, we're hardwired to want to read facial expressions, and clown makeup makes that hard. Exaggerated features send mixed messages, and a clown can simultaneously be doing something humorous while presenting an unsettling appearance. After all, showing teeth, even in what's supposed to be a comical smile, can set off instinctual alarm bells for onlookers. The appearance of clowns sends the message that they're unpredictable. And as the case of Grimaldi demonstrates, this isn't a recent pop culture development. Clowns have been making people laugh, cry, and scream for centuries. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another terrifying trio.